PFF Fantasy Podcast. I am not your usual host, Nathan Jahnke. John Macri is on PTO right now, spending some time with his family, but he will be back soon. But I am joined this week by Nic Bodiford. Nick, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Nathan?
I am doing well, excited to play host duty for once. Usually this is John's job. I make him do all the hard stuff, but luckily he gets to spend some time with his family. If you are missing him, he did pre-record an IDP podcast for later this week, so you will get your IDP fix from John if you are missing that. But today we are talking about sleeper wide receivers. I know training camps are just getting started. There's going to be plenty of news for people to overreact to. We'll get to all the training camp recap stuff later on once we finally get some news there. But until then, we both have 4 sleeper wide receivers. We're going to talk about each and then kind of react to each other's sleeper wide receivers. So that is how today will go. Not any particular order. We'll kind of go back and forth between our guys. Tried to get a variety of ADPs between our sleeper wide receivers to give you a lot of options. But we are going to get started with the New England Patriots, where we both submitted our 4 wide receivers, and we both happen to have a New England Patriot on our list. Nick, I'll let you go ahead and get started on which sleeper wide receiver from the Patriots you are excited about.
Yeah, so I think, well, we'll see what you have to say here. I feel like I'm just higher on the Patriots offense than consensus is, but my sleeper wide receiver from this team is second-year slot receiver Demario Douglas. Douglas, he put together an impressive rookie season despite rough circumstances, bad quarterback play. I think the NFL has kind of caught up to some of Belichick's coaching tactics. All things considered, he finished top 4 among NFL slot receivers with at least 65 targets in both missed tackles forced per reception and yards after the catch per reception. So, he's 5'8", he's, I think, 185 or something, but he's slippery after the catch. I think for a lot of these offenses, we have to worry about which players will have access to 2 wide receiver sets. But something that the Patriots did this offseason that encourages me in this selection is they hired Alex Van Pelt, last year's Cleveland Browns offensive coordinator, and Ben McAdoo. Van Pelt last year switched to a 3 wide receiver base offense, and McAdoo, he's got his kind of goofy, his slick back hair and everything. He's a bit of a meme in and of himself, but he runs a pretty fun offense. He kind of revolutionized the 11 personnel usage running the New York Giants offense. I think that was 2015 and 2016. So this tells me that they basically brought in the 3 wide receiver set mentor and a recent convert to the formation. I think that they're trying to set up a wide receiver heavy formation for Drake May. They might start Jacoby Brissett early on, but I think that this is geared toward being a pass first offense with Drake May under center. And I think Demario Douglas, he is being drafted where he is for a reason. I don't think that he's got wide receiver 1 upside or anything like that, but I think that he has a potential to be a weekly wide receiver 3.
Fair. First up, I'll touch on the Patriots offense. I do agree with you that they're an interesting one for this year, and why we both have a sleeper on the team. It's just they don't have a clear number 1 receiving option. They do have Ramondre Stevenson in the backfield, but it's definitely possible a wide receiver becomes the top option in this offense in general. And if Drake May's playing well, that's kind of the perfect combination for what you need for a sleeper receiver, is an opportunity to be the number 1 guy in an offense that could be a lot better. You think back to the Texans last year, and it was a similar thing where you could talk yourself into a couple of different wide receivers who could be sleepers, and it all just depends on if the offense starts clicking. And the Panthers were another team like that last year, and they didn't click last year. So it's kind of hoping the Patriots offense works out. In terms of Douglas, I'm a little concerned partially with his height and how he's used. If they do use a lot of 3 wide receiver sets and he stays in the slot, then that could be perfectly fine. I did a bunch of research this offseason on wide receiver utilization, and it's very hard for a wide receiver who only plays in 3 wide receiver sets to be a consistent fantasy starter. So it depends for me how much Douglas is also playing in those 2 wide receiver sets, because even though they should predominantly be in 11 personnel. They still will run plays out of 2 tight end sets and whatnot. So he already was used a lot in 2 wide receiver sets last year. It's very rare for a 5'8" wide receiver or shorter to line up on the outside a lot. I was looking into that, and he was already like top 20 in terms of wide receivers lining up on the outside and catching passes the past 15 years. Luckily, we do have an interesting comparison. Tank Dell fits in that conversation. He was arguably had the best season for a 5'8" wide receiver lined up on the outside of the past 15 years. So for me, a little concerned about Douglas and if he's just restricted to playing in the slot and how much they end up using 11 personnel. For me, I went with Jalen Polk as my option. He's the 37th overall pick. Typically, a wide receiver picked in the top 40 would have a lot higher ADP than he has right now in terms of a consensus ADP. Douglas is in the 14th round, Polk in the 15th round. So that's lower than you'd expect a wide receiver like that to get picked, and that's because there's just so many good wide receivers in this draft class. But he's getting picked around the same area as some like 3rd round wide receivers, Roman Wilson, Jermaine Burton. And for me, I think Polk should be the top outside wide receiver option on the team. It's really him and KJ Osborne, at least in like OTAs and mini camps. It seemed like they would be the 2 starting outside wide receivers. So I'd expect him to be the best of those 2, where Douglas has pretty consistently lined up in the slot as we expected. And that's where he shined last year. So out of him and Osborne, I think Polk has the option to be the best of the 2 outside receivers. So a lot just depends on if the offense does well. But if I'm gambling this late in the draft, it's great to gamble on rookies. And when you have someone that was drafted that highly with the potential to be the top one on his team, I think there's a situation where, yeah, a lot has to go right. But if a lot does go right, then you have a consistent fantasy starter.
Yeah, I agree. I think the field may be discounting his ability to play on the perimeter because he kind of made his hay last year thriving in the slot while Jalen McMillan had some MCL issues. But Polk is great on the perimeter. He was a very effective field stretcher. I really like him a lot too. So no arguments here with him as a sleeper. As for Osborne, I'm hoping that Javon Baker overtakes him. I think this could be a really fun, young wide receiver core by the end of the year. But Polk, I echo everything you say. Love the Polk pick.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how the rotation shakes out because like they still have Kendrick Bourne on the team. Bourne played well last year outside of injuries, so injuries are still a thing with him, but like Bourne could very well cut into both of these guys playing time if he's healthy and playing well. But it is a new offensive coordinator, so everything that was happening last year, it doesn't really matter how they all think. It matters how the new offensive coordinator and offensive minds on the team think. So we could definitely see a variety of things that could happen with the Patriots wide receivers. You could go further down the depth chart, and there's other guys that they've invested in as well. Like there's probably 9 or so players on the team that have a realistic shot of making the team. So it could end up being a big mess, but hopefully with how much they invested in, especially these 2 guys that we're talking about, hopefully they are on the field the vast majority of passing play. So we will move past the Patriots, and the next player on our list is one of my favorite sleepers at wide receiver. I'm going to go with Curtis Samuel. He has an ADP in the 11th round, so depending on how you want to define sleeper or not, he might not fit your definition, but he's definitely the highest drafted player of all the guys that we are talking about today. He's someone who signed with the Buffalo Bills in free agency. We know the Bills kind of have a couple different wide receivers on the team, Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, who could all see playing time, a few more guys further down the depth chart as well. For me, I think Samuel, he's had decent numbers throughout his career, but I don't think he's been used in the best way in the past. And I also think quarterbacks have been a problem for him in the past. Started his career in Carolina, and he had guys like Cam Newton at the end of his career, Teddy Bridgewater, Kyle Allen as his quarterbacks. Then he went to Washington, where he had Taylor Heineke, Sam Howell, Carson Wentz as his quarterbacks. So he has never had a potentially above average option at the position in the NFL. So going from everything that he's had to Josh Allen is going to be a big leap for him in terms of what he can do. And then he's also been restricted to just being a slot receiver a lot in the NFL. He had 1 year with the Panthers where he was considered an every down guy, but once he ended up in Washington, typically only played 3 wide receiver sets there. So his yards per run has been higher on the outside compared to the slot, as well as his PFF grade in recent seasons. So I think he's capable of playing on the outside, and I think he's capable of being an every down player for Buffalo. Buffalo was the team that was perfectly fine rotating their wide receivers, not necessarily saying, here's our clear slot player, here's our clear X and Z receiver. They were fine mixing players around. So I think all 3 of their wide receivers, similar-ish ADP right now, but I think Samuel has a chance to stand out from the group. His numbers have been decently similar to Shakir, but those are Shakir's numbers with Josh Allen compared to Samuel's numbers without Josh Allen. So I think Samuel is capable of putting up the best number, at least between those two. And I could see Coleman taking at least a little bit of time to develop.
Yeah, I think this is a smart pick. The Bills are clearly employing a bit of a wide receiver by committee, or at least giving a lot of guys, a lot of talented, promising guys who have had volatile careers, Coleman aside, and just seeing who can separate. And Curtis Samuel, another guy who was taken as a top 40 NFL draft pick. You did a great job outlining the brutal situations that he's been in. I don't know if he's going to be here for a long time, if he succeeds, because he is entering his either 8th or 9th season. But I could absolutely see 1,000 yards on the table for him if he is able to put it all together. He's had some rough soft tissue issues. I remember the Washington team, they had him come back from like an inguinal groin strain way too early. Should be a much improved situation for him this year. It would be really cool to see him succeed after so many years of potential promise. Moving on to the next guy, Los Angeles Rams wide receiver, Demarcus Robinson. So sort of a similar veteran journeyman to Curtis Samuel. Demarcus Robinson last year resoundingly stole the number 3 wide receiver job from Tutu Atwell. Closed the year with, I think, 4 straight games with a touchdown. Maybe there was the final he didn't score. I'm doing this off memory, but 4 straight scoring games. He had 2 games in which he totaled 10 targets. 2 of those 4 games totaled 10 targets. And listening to the Athletics' Jordan Rodrigue talk about the offense this year, they love him. He's going to be their starting X wide receiver. This is one of those teams where it's the X is not the true number 1, but he's going to be playing on the perimeter, full complement of snaps, 3 wide receiver sets for in the Matthew Stafford, Sean McVay offense. If one of these 2 guys, Puka or Cooper Kupp, get injured, Robinson is immediately a wide receiver starter. I also really like the LA schedule. I wrote some of these opponents down here because I think he can be startable even with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua healthy, active, all that good stuff. They face the Arizona Cardinals twice, obviously, including the Week 17 Fantasy Football Championship game, which is helpful. Chicago Bears, Jalen Johnson, obviously great, but Tariq Stevenson leaves a lot to be desired on the perimeter. Green Bay Packers, Eric Stokes. Las Vegas Raiders, Jacorian Bennett. Minnesota Vikings, blanking on the perimeter guy there. But point is, these are really beatable secondaries. Even if they've got one standout guy, I think it's safe to assume that the standout perimeter defensive back is going to be on either Puka or Cooper Kupp, which is going to give Demarcus Robinson a lot of opportunities against these lesser coverage defenders. So I think that he'll be a matchup-based wide receiver 3 / flex option, which if he is able to hit that, returning value in the 18th round should not be any issue at all for him.
Fair. I think you bring up some good points, especially with him being a handcuff. That was my big point with him is there's not that many handcuff wide receivers out there, but he's someone where once one of those 2 guys goes down, then I'm definitely trusting him a lot more with targets. Also perfectly fine in best ball trusting him, but my concern is I don't know which weeks he's going to have a great week and which weeks he won't, who will be the targets each week. So I have a hard time seeing myself trusting him to put him in my starting lineup in any given week when everyone is healthy. So that's part of my concern. And then also is just a small sample size where he was doing well, didn't emerge as the starter until late in the season. And we have a long career of Robinson not being much of a fantasy factor. This was the first time he's ever had more than 65 receiving yards in more than one game in a season. And he did that twice this past year. So in back-to-back games. So part of me is like, well, I think we have a career of knowing that Robinson's not going to get targeted a lot, and then all of a sudden he did. So teams at this point may have adjusted and will start covering him a little bit more than what they were at the end of last year. So a little bit of concern about just his career as a receiver and this being a small sample size and him being the clear number 3 receiver. But like you said, this is the Rams offense where they run 11 personnel, the vast majority of plays more than basically any other team. So we'll expect Robinson to be on the receiver or be on the field a lot. And I'm not as concerned about him compared to plenty of other number 3 receivers. It's just a lot of it depends on the league I'm in. And one, if I have enough bench spots where I can roster him, as well as have enough starting spots where I would consider starting him. But if I'm only starting like 3 wide receivers in the league, I have a hard time seeing myself ranking Robinson in those top 36 in any given week, unless there's an injury, in which case he'd be much higher than the top 36. So we will move on to our next player, and that is going to be my guy, Brandon Cooks. I was looking at it and remembering Cooks' time as a Ram and like, do I need to scroll past this? But no, Cooks is my next guy with the Dallas Cowboys. He's like I just went through, has had a long career with a lot of teams. He's had top 20 fantasy seasons with some elite quarterbacks. He's had some top 20 seasons with some okay quarterbacks like Jared Goff early in his career, even top 20 when Davis Mills was his quarterback. So Cooks has had a long career of being a great fantasy asset. If you look at what he did last year in Dallas and as a whole, his numbers didn't look all that great, but if you break it down to the parts of the season, he did not look that good at the beginning of the season, missed a little time with injury. They were rotating him in and out a little bit more than he's used to, and his numbers just weren't that great. But then once you get to about week 10, he had a breakout performance and then continued to play pretty well from that point on. He was rotated out less frequently, and from week 10 until the end of the season, so that's the second half of the season, the last 9 weeks, he was wide receiver 14. So he was playing very well over the second half of the season, just not good over the first half. And this was his first season with Dallas, and there was injuries in there. So it's not all that surprising that it took him a little bit time to get assimilated into the offense well. But at this point, I think he's going to continue to be the clear number 2 wide receiver for Dallas. They no longer have Michael Gallup and didn't really invest in the position outside of a 6th round draft pick. So I think he still can get plenty of targets at wide receiver. They also downgraded at running back. They no longer have Tony Pollard. They brought back Ezekiel Elliott. So I think not only will there be fewer targets for wide receivers outside of him and CeeDee Lamb, but also fewer targets for the running back position. So I think the targets will be there, even though, of course, CeeDee Lamb will have a ton of targets. Also very optimistic about Jake Ferguson, but I think this offense, with how much they're going to need to pass the ball, considering the running backs on the team, I think there are plenty of targets to go around for Cooks to see a lot of targets. And yeah, I don't see him being a top 10 fantasy wide receiver anytime soon, but I think he's capable of being in fantasy starting lineups basically week in and week out, and kind of a great player to draft along with some of these other players that we're talking about that are a bit more risky. I think if you have someone who can be consistent like Cooks can, you can have him in your lineup week in and week out, and then if one of these other rookies or sleepers ends up working out, then you end up putting them in your lineup instead.
Yeah. And so at the beginning of your segment there, you were talking about Cook's time with the Rams, and I think Cooks is still a very good player. I'm in my mind, I'm kind of comparing him to Demarcus Robinson if one of Kupp or Nakua were not on the Rams, where he just has this open runway to 100+ targets. He's competing against, a tight end. I love Jake Ferguson, but he's competing against a tight end, Jalen Tolbert, and then maybe Ezekiel Elliott is able to command a decent target share out of the backfield. But the offense as it currently stands is begging for one of these wide receivers to just go out there and do their assigned tasks on a play-to-play basis. I think Cooks can absolutely do that. Agree with everything that you're saying here. I think he's absolutely deserves to be on the sleeper list.
Yeah,
on to the next one.
I was going to say he is getting drafted in the 12th round. So outside of Samuel, he's probably the second player getting drafted out of all the guys we're talking about. So we are talking about some deeper sleepers from this point on, but Cook's 12th round and happy with his value there.
Yeah. Staying in the same division here, moving over to the Washington Commanders. I've written up Luke McCaffrey, rookie Luke McCaffrey a couple times this offseason, and I direct viewers and listeners over to the early season draft piece, the NFL Draft's best role players and must draft rookie wide receivers. If you want to take a deep dive statistical look at Luke McCaffrey's 2-year receiving profile, he first went to Rice University as a quarterback before switching to the receiver position. So he's only been playing for 2 years, but he immediately excelled in a very specific over the middle role. He was doing this running through the box, earning targets, and in his second season in the role, began stretching the field vertically. His receiving profile is extremely impressive. One wonders what he could have done if he had been executing this job since high school, but he did a very good job, all things considered, being new to the position. He lands in a Washington offense that maybe similar to Dallas is kind of begging for somebody to stand out alongside the number one receiver, in this case, Terry McLaurin. I'm looking at their depth chart right now. Olamide Zaccheaus. I know everybody loves Ben Sinnott, but we still have Zach Ertz here. I'm not concerned with Ertz. And Ben Sinnott, while the receiving profile is exciting, we don't know what his role is. There are rumblings that he has like a use check type profile. So if this guy's out there doing blocking specialty plays, I don't know if he's really going to be fantasy relevant. As for Jahan Dotson, he's had, 2 years in the NFL now? Yep. I'm pulling up his profile right now. He was, if you configured his statistical, if you looked at his advanced metrics in his rookie season, you could get him to clearing 2 yards per out run if you shave off certain games and account for health and all that. But I think that for those who were kind of trying to make the case that Dotson still had a decent rookie season, his follow-up campaign was abysmal. And to be clear, rookie campaign, only 1.39 yards per out run. In his second season, 0.82. This was a huge step back. He still has the first-round draft capital, and he does have access to this number 2 role, but it is my opinion that Luke McCaffrey is quietly competing for the number 2 pass catching role in Washington. Now, if we get negative signal 1 month from now and it doesn't look like this is the case, then obviously his sleeper dreams are going up in smoke. But right now we can get a guy who may be the team's number 2 pass catcher. He's going in the 21st round in PPR formats. And like I said, a really strong 2-year profile after converting to this position in 2022. So understand that it's perhaps long odds, but I think he is a better chance at being a 2024 sleeper than some may be giving him credit for.
That's fair. He's currently by consensus ADP getting drafted in the 21st round, so you're not investing a lot if you're picking him up. I was looking at players drafted in that round, and part of me is thinking I would rather get a running back because they have a higher chance of hitting really big in that range. But if you're looking at a wide receiver there, compared to the wide receivers who are around, I started getting more excited about McCaffrey the more that I was researching him after you said that you wanted him as a sleeper here. So I think Cliff Kingsbury's offense helps him here. I expect him to be the slot receiver when they're in 3 wide receiver sets. They do have, like you said, a couple of veteran options at the position. I think Jamison Crowder is still there as well, but McCaffrey should be able to win that slot job at the very least. And over Kingsbury's 4 years with the Cardinals, they had the second most receptions, receiving yards with slot receivers. And typically when you see that over a 4-year stretch, you think it's one guy who's getting a lot of the work. But that was like Larry Fitzgerald for 1 year. Christian Kirk was in there. Rondale Moore, Greg Dortch, all bunch of different slot guys playing for Arizona over his time there. All of them finding at least some level of success, and especially the thought of like a lot of slot receivers tend to be smaller guys, but Luke McCaffrey, a bit taller, and Larry Fitzgerald fit that mold as well. So while I'm not saying he's Larry Fitzgerald, Kingsbury does have experience with taller slot receivers in his offense. So I think that is beneficial. But also reading reports of how he's been used in minicamp, training camp, they tried to move him around, get him accustomed to multiple wide receiver positions, which I think speaks to what you're saying is that he has a shot at being the number 2 guy. And even if he doesn't get the number 2 role, there's a chance that one of the wide receivers gets injured at some point this season, in which case McCaffrey would get elevated to the 2 spot. So whether he wins the job or gets there due to injury, it's a possibility he's the number 2 wide receiver in this offense at some point this season. And I think that's like an interesting thing as well of a lot of slot guys, if another wide receiver gets injured, they're not necessarily going to start seeing more playing time in the league. And last year when there were injuries, it's not like they started playing on the outside or anything. They just continued playing in the slot and 3 receiver sets. But if McCaffrey has that opportunity to play on the outside, potentially taking some of those snaps in 2 wide receiver sets, there's a possibility. And this is another team where they have a rookie quarterback, new offensive play caller, which adds just more and more uncertainty to how everything will work out. And when you add that uncertainty, we're talking more about trying to find that low percentage chance of this happening. But if it does happen, it could be really good things happening. So there's the possibility McCaffrey's the number 2 wide receiver and this offense plays really well this year. So I definitely see the path there. And with how late you're picking him, I think he is a better gamble than a lot of the other guys who are getting picked in that range. A lot of other more so veteran number 3 receivers. We were talking about KJ Osborne earlier. He kind of fits that, or like that's around where Osborne is getting drafted. So I would much rather take a risk on McCaffrey, who could be anywhere from not winning that slot job to potentially being the number 2 wide receiver, versus someone like Osborne, where we know what his limitations are. We know how good he can be. He's at best going to be a wide receiver 3 on a fantasy team, and that's if everything's going well. So I'd rather take a chance on McCaffrey where we don't know as much about who he will end up being in the league. And like you said, he's only been a wide receiver for 2 years now, so definitely plenty of time for him to improve at the position. All right, we will go on to my last sleeper. We were just talking about the Arizona Cardinals offense with Cliff Kingsbury in his time there, and I will go to another Arizona Cardinals wide receiver, and that's Michael Wilson. Wilson, 3rd-round pick last year, immediately won the Z receiver job with the team. Had a little bit of a slow start, but then rebounded and really started being a good deep threat for the team. Had a decent amount of fantasy success over the first half of the season, and that was even with Joshua Dobbs at quarterback. He was wide receiver 40 from weeks 2 to 8, so definitely not a huge start to a season, but when you consider where he was drafted, who was his quarterback at that time, I thought it was impressive that he did that good over the first half of the season. Then suffered a shoulder injury, missed a bit of time, finally got to play with Kyler Murray after not really getting to play with him during the preseason, during early parts of the season. It took a little bit for him to click with Murray, and then over the last 2 weeks of the season, he was wide receiver 16 over those 2 weeks. So obviously small sample size there, but finally being able to play well with Murray in his last 2 games with Murray, it was good for me to see that. Obviously, they drafted Marvin Harrison Jr., basically going to be a direct replacement for Hollywood Brown in terms of where he's lining up in the offense, where the snaps are coming from. Expect Harrison to command more targets than Brown was getting last year, but I don't expect that to at least impact Wilson's playing time. So still expect Wilson to be that Z receiver playing in 2 wide receiver sets, and then Greg Dortch playing in the slot in 3 receiver sets. So that's how I expect the offense to be, with Harrison as the X receiver. And the big thing that I was excited about all late last season while I was waiting for him to recover from his injury is Wilson was doing good on those deep targets. He has a high average depth of target. And Murray, the one thing that he's been pretty consistent about through his career is being an accurate deep ball thrower. So I think combining Kyler Murray's ability to make deep plays with Wilson's ability to make big plays, and Harrison's a clear wide receiver to be excited about in this offense, but if everything is going well in the offense, there could be room for another receiver, and I think Wilson is able to have a good season with Arizona.
Yeah, I think one way to put this is that Michael Wilson controls his own destiny, just with the way the wide receiver personnel grouping is currently set. Yeah, like you said, he's got to compete with Harrison. McBride will probably be number 2 on the team in targets, but he does have access to a starting role. If he can do it, he'll do it. Nothing will stand in his way in becoming the number 2, so to speak. And I know that I love watching Greg Dortch play and everything, but Wilson can win this role. If he is good enough to do it, he'll do it. So I from a process standpoint, I think that this is a totally reasonable sleeper to roll the dice on. Should we move on to our last guy?
Yeah, I'll just add, similar to what we were talking about with Demarcus Robinson, and that we know the coverage is going to be away from him. We know that he's going to be the option that the defense is going to put the least amount of resources towards. A similar thing with Wilson. We know if anyone's getting double covered in that offense, it's Harrison. You have to worry about those guys in the middle of the field. Wilson should pretty consistently get whichever of the worst outside corner options there are without that much safety help. So expecting Wilson to be able to take advantage of not having to face the best coverage the defense has to offer.
So as for our last guy, this one is a total, free 99 dart throw. Former Washington slot receiver Jalen McMillan, now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. Some of this is absolutely projection on my part. I'm looking at the complexion of the Bucs wide receiver room, and we see Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and then Trey Palmer. I know that the coaching staff has said Godwin is going to play in the slot more than he did last year. But if they are going to do that, this means that I just can't see them rolling Trey Palmer out there as the number 3 again all year long. After the season he put together in his 2023 rookie season, he was a 6th round pick. I know some folks in the dynasty community liked him. He's speedy. He can get downfield. He can get down there. But his ability to actually do anything with his opportunity has yet to be shown. Earned a 14% target rate, was under 1 yard on a per route basis. I just don't think that Palmer is an NFL caliber starting wide receiver. Jalen McMillan, so as mentioned earlier, he had recurring hamstring. I think he had 2 grade 2, or he suffered a grade 2 MCL sprain and then aggravated the injury once or twice during the season last year. But if you go look at his data from the year prior, this was arguably the second best receiver on the team behind Rome Odunze. He outperformed Jalen Polk, who I really like. His data when lined up on the perimeter is nowhere near as strong as when he's in the slot. And so maybe we are just betting on a guy who's a slot-only player, and as you've outlined earlier, that could make it really difficult for him to return value. But I think Jalen McMillan is good. I think that he belongs in the NFL. I think that he belongs in a starting roster. And the question then becomes, can he, 1, adapt to the perimeter if they really are going to stick to the Chris Godwin in the slot thing? And 2, are they going to prioritize Godwin over McMillan? Yeah, they will. But when looking at the ecosystem as a whole, I think if they commit to this and McMillan is incapable of playing efficiently on the perimeter, they already know Trey Palmer is incapable of playing efficiently. So just looking at this 3 wide receiver set, I think Evans, Godwin, and McMillan make the most sense. Baker Mayfield's already praised him once this offseason, McMillan, that is. If we don't get any negative signal, this guy does not cost you anything to cut. So, I'm not telling you to stick with him if it seems like it's not going to pan out. But right now, I'm going to be shocked if Jalen McMillan is the number 4 receiver behind Trey Palmer.
Fair. And at this point, his ADP is most places that track ADP don't have an ADP for him. So this is typically in deeper leagues if you're looking for a wide receiver to stash. One positive thing I have for him, Liam Cohen, the new offensive coordinator for the Buccaneers. His time in the NFL has mostly been with the Rams. The Rams typically spend a lot of time in 11 personnel, and they also don't necessarily always have a strict slot receiver. They've been comfortable rotating their wide receivers around the formation, having different guys line up in the slot on different plays. I know Cohen wasn't the offensive coordinator for them last year, but I remember earlier last year when Tutu Atwell was the 3rd receiver, there were times where all 3 receivers were playing roughly 1/3 of their snaps in the slot, and it was just a huge rotation. I don't remember exactly what it was years before that, but I know it's not always necessarily been here's the clear slot receiver for the team. So it's a possibility that both players see some time in the slot, which would be good for him there. And then it's an example again where, he might not be anywhere close to a fantasy starter if Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are both healthy. But if one of them were to suffer an injury, we know Godwin has dealt with injuries a little bit recently, and Mike Evans has been incredibly dependable, but there's always a chance that any player suffers an injury. So there's at least a chance Evans suffers an injury. The one thing that I am a little bit concerned about, I know Sterling Shepard has not done a lot recently in his career with the Giants, but he does have familiarity with Baker Mayfield. Mayfield, I believe, is the primary reason that Shepard is on the roster right now. So I wouldn't count it out for Shepard not to be a full-time number 3 wide receiver for the team, but to at least earn some snaps as part of a rotation at this point of his career. So I know he basically fell out of the picture with the Giants on a team that did not have much depth at wide receiver, but I would not be all that surprised if Shepard at least sees a little bit of playing time, limiting the amount of time of the other young Buccaneers wide receivers, at least early in the season. Yeah, I guess that will about wrap it up for us. We've gone through the 8 sleeper wide receivers, but we will go ahead and get back next week. Like I said earlier in the show, John will be back later this week with an IDP episode, and then we will back to normal next week, as well as potentially ramping up the schedule as we get closer and closer to the start of the season. We are just 1 week away from the Hall of Fame game and get to have preseason fantasy football recaps, so I am very much looking forward to that. Nick, do you want to let everyone know where they can find you? If there's anything that you want to plug, go ahead and do that.
Yes, thank you. So you guys can follow me on Twitter at Nic Bodiford NFL, NICBODIFORD NFL. You can find my work at PFF.com and at NBC Sports Roto World. Starting my written work there is starting to pick up, mostly doing behind the scenes stuff right now, but my PFF work is as busy as ever. Articles coming out 3 or 4 days, I think 4 days a week at this point. So give me a read over there. Thank you very much for having me, Nathan.
Yeah, it's been fun. And just let you know, my stuff always at PFF Nate Jahnke for the social medias. And then articles, I've been having a ton of player profiles, trying to pump out at least 3 of those a day. So have had a lot of fun with those. A lot of different graphs and stats that you're not going to find elsewhere in those articles. Also continue to do perfect draft strategies, focus on 10-team leagues this week, as well as I'll start to get into league winners later this week, as well as next week. And then also the tools at PFF. I've been spending a lot of time with our team that have been working on the tools recently and have excited for where things are going there. The mock draft simulator is live, so if you want to prepare for your drafts, you can use my rankings and our projections and help you figure out who you should be drafting, especially like I have my articles that focus on specific picks in specific league settings, but I can't write those articles for every kind of league and every kind of scoring type and every kind of combination of starters and bench players. So if I don't have the perfect article for you in terms of your league settings, definitely use the mock draft simulator for that, as well as our live draft assistant when it finally gets time for you to start drafting. So with that, like I said, we'll be back next week, and John will be back later this week. But until then, peace out.